Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into a really interesting set of sources. They're trying to make a purely rational case for, well, an uncaused intelligent source, what many call God, but strictly avoiding any scriptural authority. So our goal here is to unpack how these authors weave together modern physics, cosmology, quantum mechanics. It's a pretty classic philosophy, the core argument, that the universe's existence and, crucially, its expansion points towards an intelligent, necessary being.
It's definitely an ambitious argument they lay out. The central idea in the source material is that the way the universe is expanding, its structure, it all implies a cause that isn't itself caused. And they define this cause as acting from, get this, a non-local domain, so something outside our familiar space and time influencing our local physical reality. This isn't just armchair philosophy. They're grounding it in observations from physics.
Yeah, it's really striking. They're using 21st century science not to, dismiss the big questions about origins, but actually to argue for an ultimate source.
Yeah.
It's quite a twist. Let's see how they build this case. Maybe starting with the biggest picture possible, the universe itself.
Okay, so the foundation seems to be modern cosmology. We have to start with Edwin Hubble back in 1929. Before him, the view was mostly a static, eternal universe, right? What did his observations change?
Fundamentally everything, really. Hubble looked at distant galaxies and saw their light was redshifted. That was the evidence. The universe isn't static, it's expanding. And if it's expanding, well, you run the clock backwards. Everything gets closer, denser, hotter, leading right back to an incredibly compact state, the Big Bang.
So the universe isn't some kind of eternal engine that's always been running. It looks like it had a definite start. And that's where the physics connects with philosophy, specifically something called the Kalam cosmological argument. Can you remind us just briefly what that argument states? Sure. It's based on pretty simple logic. Premise 1. Anything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Premise 2, which Hubble's work supports, is that the universe began to exist. The conclusion, therefore, is that the universe must have a cause. And the authors really hammer this point home with some powerful math. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, or BGV theorem from 2003. This isn't philosophy, it's physics, and it backs up that finite beginning.
BGV theorem. Okay, sounds technical. For those of us not deep in theoretical physics, what's the essential takeaway?
It's actually profound. It shows that any universe, or even a multiverse scenario, anything that has, on average, been expanding throughout its history, it simply cannot be infinitely old. It has to be past and complete, meaning it must have a beginning. It sort of puts a mathematical seal on the idea that the universe isn't eternal in the past, lending strong support to that Kalam argument.
Okay, so science points to the Big Bang as the start of physical reality, space, time, matter, energy. But that leads to a huge question. If space and time themselves began then, how does the source material argue the cause must be non-physical and timeless? Couldn't it just be some earlier physical state?
That's the crucial step in their logic. If the cause was physical, it would exist within space and time. And if it existed within space and time, it would itself require a cause because it would have begun to exist. You'd just push the problem back. So they argue to bring space and time into existence, the cause must logically stand outside of them. It has to be, by its very nature, immaterial, timeless, and spaceless, essentially not part of the universe it originated.
Right. And that conclusion that the cause must be timeless and immaterial really pushes us from physics into classical metaphysics. Specifically, they lean heavily on the principle of sufficient reason. The PSR, Leibniz is maybe the most famous proponent.
The principle of sufficient reason. That sounds
Okay,
fundamental.
right.
What does it actually mean in practice for us trying to follow the argument? At its core, the PSR asserts that everything that exists must have an explanation, a reason for why it exists. Either that reason is found within its own nature or it's external to it. Think of it like this, the classic example. You find a complex watch lying on a beach. You instinctively know it didn't just assemble itself from sand and waves. It requires an explanation beyond the immediate surroundings, a watchmaker. The universe, they argue, is infinitely more complex than any watch.
Okay, that analogy makes sense. But for the PSR to apply to the universe, we first need to establish that the universe needs an external explanation. This brings up the idea of contingency. Why is the universe considered contingent?
Good question. Contingent basically means something exists, but it could have not existed. Or it could have existed differently. Think about yourself, or this planet, or even the laws of physics as we know them. None of these seem absolutely necessary. Contrast that with something like, say, the truths of mathematics. 2 + 2 = 4 seems necessarily true. It couldn't be otherwise. The universe, with all its specific constants and features, doesn't seem to have that kind of necessity. It's contingent. And contingent things, according to the PSR, need an explanation outside themselves.
All right, so the universe is contingent, needs an external cause. We traced it back to a non-physical, timeless cause at the Big Bang. But what stops us from asking, well, what caused that cause? Doesn't this just lead to an infinite regress?
Ah, the infinite regress problem. That's a classic philosophical hurdle, and the sources tackle it directly. They argue that an infinite chain of contingent causes actually explains nothing fundamental. Imagine that train analogy again. A train is moving, and you explain the last car's motion by the car in front of it, and that car by the one before it, and so on. If the chain of cars is infinite, you've explained the motion of each car relative to the next, but you haven't explained why the train is moving at all.
Right, you still need something to initiate the motion.
An engine.
Exactly. Philosophers like Alexander Pruss argue that an infinite regress of contingent causes just kicks the can down the road indefinitely. It presupposes the very existence or motion it's trying to explain.
So the conclusion is? The conclusion is that the chain of contingency must terminate somewhere. It requires a necessary being, something whose existence isn't dependent on anything else, something that exists by its own nature and is uncaused. This necessary being is the ultimate explanation, the engine that grounds all contingent reality. The authors explicitly link this to the classical idea, like you find in Aquinas, of God as the ontological ground of being, the uncaused cause.
Okay, so we follow the logic to an uncaused, immaterial, timeless, necessary being. That's already a huge step. But here's where it gets, I think, really interesting and maybe more controversial for some. Why does this source argue the cause must also be intelligent? Couldn't it just be some fundamental impersonal force or law, like gravity, but, ultimate?
That's a critical pivot point in their argument. They introduce the requirement for intentional agency. The reasoning goes something like this. If the necessary being is eternal and timeless, its fundamental nature doesn't change. Now, if this being was purely impersonal, just a force operating by necessity, it seems it would either always be producing the universe, meaning the universe would be eternal alongside it, or never producing the universe. There's no mechanism for it to decide to start things.
Ah, okay. So because the Big Bang happened at a specific point, or rather was the beginning of time, that implies a change from non-creation to creation.
Precisely. To move from a state of timeless potentiality to the actuality of a universe beginning its expansion requires, they argue, an act of volition, an intention. This cause had to, in some sense, choose to initiate reality. It had to select the specific universe with its specific laws and starting conditions from potentially infinite other possibilities.
So selecting one possibility implies a mind, an agent, capable of making that selection.
That's the core of the argument. Impersonal necessity, like a mathematical equation, doesn't make choices. It just is, or it acts uniformly according to its nature. Only something akin to a mind, an intelligent agent, can possess the freedom to initiate an effect like the universe from a state of timeless being.
Wow. Okay, so that connects the dots. The cause isn't just uncaused, immaterial, and timeless. It also has to be intelligent because the universe began, implying a purposeful act. Let's bring physics back into the picture, but shift gears to the really small scale, the strange world of quantum mechanics. How does this field, which often seems counterintuitive, actually reinforce the idea that the ultimate source might be non-local? I think we need to talk about entanglement.
Right, quantum entanglement. It's one of the most bizarre yet experimentally verified aspects of quantum theory. Einstein famously called it spooky action at a distance. It shows that two particles, once linked, can remain connected in a deep way even when separated by vast distances. If you measure a property of one particle, say its spin, you instantaneously know the spin of the other, no matter how far apart they are.
Faster than light can travel between them.
Exactly. It's as if they aren't truly separate entities, but are parts of a single, unified system, regardless of spatial separation. This points towards what physicists call non-locality. It suggests that, at a fundamental level, reality might be structured by information or connections that aren't limited by our everyday understanding of space and time. There's a deeper layer that seems to operate non-locally.
And experiments, like those based on Bell's theorem, have repeatedly confirmed this non-locality is real, right? It's not just theory.
Correct. It's an empirically established feature of our universe. So the paper argues, if the very fabric of our physical reality exhibits non-locality, isn't it reasonable to infer that the origin of this local reality might itself stem from a non-local source?
A source outside space and time acting non-locally to initiate and structure the universe.
Precisely. And this ties back neatly to the idea of intelligence and agency. The authors contend that simply appealing to random quantum fluctuations isn't enough to explain the jump from non-being to the specific ordered being of our universe. They argue that causality, especially at the ultimate level of creation, requires more than just impersonal quantum fields. It requires something like intentional action operating from that non-local domain. A non-local, uncaused, intelligent mind becomes, in their view, the most coherent explanation for how our local, structured universe came to be.
Okay, but what about the common pushback from some areas of physics? The idea that maybe the universe did just arise from quantum phenomena, like quantum tunneling from nothing. We often hear about models like the Hawking and Hartle no-boundary proposal. How does the source material deal with those?
They address those models directly. The critique offered isn't so much about the physics details, but about the philosophical presuppositions. The argument is that these models don't actually eliminate the need for an ultimate explanation. They essentially just shift the question. Think about it. For a universe to tunnel into existence via quantum mechanics, what needs to be in place before that event?
Well, you'd need the laws of quantum mechanics themselves, right?
Yep.
And maybe the quantum field.
Exactly. These models presuppose a whole pre-existing framework. The laws of physics, the mathematical structures, the quantum fields with their potential energy. They explain the transition within that framework, but they don't explain the framework itself.
So the question just becomes, why those laws? Why that mathematical structure? Why do quantum fields exist at all?
Precisely. If those laws and fields are themselves contingent, if they could have been different or not existed, then they still require an explanation, a grounding. The authors actually quote the physicist Alexander Vilenkin, who, remember, helped develop the BGV theorem, confirming the beginning, conceding this point. He apparently wrote something like, "The laws of physics must have existed before the universe."
Wow, that's a significant admission from a cosmologist.
It really is. Because it pushes the question back beyond the physical beginning to the origin of the laws that govern physics.
Which means the uncaused source we've been tracing can't just be the initiator of the Big Bang. It must also be the ultimate ground for the very laws and mathematical intelligibility that make physics possible in the first place.
That's the final layer of their argument. The necessary being isn't just needed to start the universe, it's needed to explain why there's an ordered, rational, law-governed reality at all. So far from refuting the need for a cause, quantum cosmology, by highlighting the role of pre-existing laws, actually strengthens the case for an ultimate intelligent ground of all being. Hashtag outro. So if we just step back and synthesize what this line of reasoning suggests, drawing only from observed physics and principles of rational thought, carefully avoiding any specific religious texts, we end up outlining a cause with some very specific attributes. It needs to be uncaused, existing by its own necessity. It needs to be immaterial, timeless, and spaceless, existing outside the physical universe. It seems to operate non-locally. And crucially, it appears to possess intelligence and intentional agency to account for the universe's beginning and its ordered nature.
Yeah, the conclusion presented in the source material is quite stark. Physics, they say, is incredibly powerful for describing how the universe works, how it expands, how things interact. But it hits a wall when you ask why there is a universe at all, or why it has the specific features it does. This synthesis of cosmology, quantum physics, and philosophy argues that an intelligent, uncaused, non-local source is actually the most coherent answer to those ultimate why questions, an answer that aligns surprisingly well with the classical philosophical understanding of God. It's definitely a dense and compelling argument, built step by step from scientific observation and logical inference. And it leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to mull over. If this case for an intelligent, uncaused source holds water, what does that really imply about the fundamental laws of nature we study? Are these laws just brute facts about the universe that we happen to discover? Or could they be something more like expressions-derived features reflecting the inherent nature and intention of that ultimate intelligent source? Something to think about.